Good afternoon. This is Youngdan here on Youngdan Radio. Today I hope to have a very interesting guest on with me, and that man's name is Wayne Green. He's up in New Hampshire, and he has some very insightful opinions that I would like to explore, at least some of them today. All right. Hello, Wayne. Are you on the line?
I think so.
Very good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just great.
Now, most people that will be listening to my show will not have heard of you. Would you like to tell us a few things about yourself before we get started?
Oh, sure. Have you got 4 hours for that?
I have 4 days.
Well, I was born in Littleton, New Hampshire, 4 generations in that town. And I'm an entrepreneur. I love starting new businesses and teaching others to do that. And I like, I'm a visionary. And I see new technologies that look very promising, and I help develop them. And I look into things. I'm very skeptical about what people believe, and I say, let's look into it and see what the real facts are. And I keep uncovering more and more secrets, things that people don't know but really need to know. For instance, the biggest secret in the world is how easy it is to cure any illness with no drugs, any, and without fail. But that would destroy the $3 trillion medical industry and put hundreds of thousands of doctors out of work and put thousands of hospitals out of business and pretty much destroy today's food industry as we know it. So I wrote a book on that called The Secret Guide to Health. And
I have that book right here in my hand, actually. Now, to give people an indication, how would you describe your health at the moment? And would you describe yourself as a young man or a middle-aged man?
Well, I'm 88 years old, and I'm in excellent health, and active, and so forth.
So you're a perfect example of which you speak.
Well, yes, pretty good. And I was fortunate in that I had a very good start. I had a mother 88 years ago that did not feed me what most mothers feed their babies today. And I was fed cooked cereal with cream, and I was not fed any jam, jelly, cookies, soda, any sugars. And so I grew up with perfect teeth until World War II, and we had a war, which you've read about.
Yes, indeed.
And I joined the Navy, and 4 years later I had to have my first filling on Navy food. So, but I was very fortunate in getting a good start in health.
So while you were in the Navy, I'll just put in here because I'll be getting back to it later. You were a radio operator, is that correct?
No, I was the electronic technician. I'm the one that kept everything running, and kept the radios, the radar, the sonar, underwater sound, the whole works. I kept them going. And so that was my responsibility. And I operated the radar and the sonar when we were at battle stations. And we were very active. We were one of the top scoring submarines. My boat is on display down in Mobile, Alabama at Battleship Park. And you see pictures of me 70 years ago. There on the mounted in the boat.
Very good. So, looking through today, you say here there's a lot of problems facing the United States. Now, some of those problems, and indeed many of them, are very similar to the problems facing Ireland at the moment. So, I'd like to pick your brain on a few things, if at all possible.
Okay, pick away. I've got plenty here for you.
Now, the most important thing, as I see it, and a lot of people is with the debt problem. And we'll say how the debt problem that has surfaced in Europe specifically, and they're unable to repay their debts. And there's an interesting sort of thing. Ireland, of course, cannot repay their debts, and they've just been bailed out. But, of course, some people would describe that as they're actually being bailed in. They're not being bailed out at all, but they're being bailed in by money that they've gotten from numerous sources, some of which is about 17 billion of their own pension money. Some is coming from the IMF, and some is from the European Central Bank. Would you like to tell us, as your understanding of it is, how the central banks work with the Federal Reserve? They seem to be able to come up with money out of thin air. Can you give a brief description as to how that, and then we can get on to what is frequently referred to as debt-free money, which would be part of the solution. But can you give us a bit of a background on the problem first before we begin?
Well, sure. This started for us back in 1913 when a group of Democrats got together early one morning after midnight and put through the Federal Reserve Bank system. Up until then, our Treasury issued our money and printed our money, and we had no inflation for the first 137 years that the United States was in business. And since then, we've had humongous inflation. As a matter of fact, 3 cents in 1913 bought what a dollar buys today. And it looks like the inflation is going to get more and more because the Federal Reserve is issuing billions of dollars more in paper money with nothing to back it. So, and we have our expenses, and of course we make up for that by borrowing the money to cover those. Every state is losing money. Every state has billions of dollars in losses. And I've explained, I said, look, there's a simple way to cut any government expense, federal or state, and cut it substantially. The United States government has doubled in size just in the last few years. And we could have every bureau, every department of the government cut itself in half in 3 years with everybody involved enthusiastically cooperating. Now, how's that?
That sounds pretty good. So what you're saying is you could reduce the government
expenses
back to what it was, we'll say 5 years ago, 2005, when it was even too big at that stage.
And we can keep on going and cut it again. And the system is simple and foolproof. So what you do is you take any government bureau and say, look, here is your budget for 2011. At the end of the year, at the end of the fiscal year, if there's any money left over, not spent, you split it with the people in the department. They are not going to buy an extra envelope.
That would give them a reason to conserve, sure enough.
Exactly. Then at the end of the fiscal year, you say, okay, next year, your fiscal year is what you actually spent last year. And if there's any money left over, you'll split it with everybody in the department. And by 3 years, you'll have cut down to 1/2 the size, and by 6 years, probably to 1/4, and be far more efficient and effective.
Well, that's probably the opposite of what is in the situation at the moment for people in the department. If they don't spend all of their budget, they have no reason to demand an increased budget in the coming year.
Well, I can testify to that because I had a chain of computer stores, 58 of them coast to coast, and one was in Washington, D.C. And in the few weeks before the end of the fiscal year, the government's fiscal year, I did more business and got more business for my computer store than in the other 11 months combined.
Well, perhaps you should have had 2 or 3 stores in Washington, D.C. then. Getting back to the Federal Reserve. So that was organized in 1913, as you said, by a guy called a Connecticut senator called Aldrich. What relationship, if you can remember, was Aldrich to, we'll say, the Rockefellers? Or who were the people who were pushing Aldrich to make these decisions?
Well, it was the international bankers, and Rockefeller was certainly one of them, the Rockefeller family. And there was a few other families that were involved with that. They have banks in many of the different countries and pretty much control the currencies of these countries.
So coming up, you say that the Federal Reserve, the money system was increasing.
Well, just one of the things. Sure.
And eventually, of course, the French decided that to call the American bluff in a sense. And they called their bluff in the sense that the French had realized there wasn't enough gold backing the currency as what was promised to back it. So there was a run on gold in 1971. Is that what happened after that then?
Well, of course, with nothing to back it, you can print all the money you want.
Okay, so Nixon was forced to go off the gold standard then.
So they've been running their printing presses.
Ever since. So now, the government today, to get its money, it sells its bonds to private investors or funds or whatever. Can you explain to us exactly what quantitative easing is? Is that when there's no longer a big enough market for the bonds and the Federal Reserve has to step in and sort of support the market or at least buy some of the bonds?
Well, as I understand it, the biggest buyers of our bonds are like China, and they're one of our biggest creditors.
So the danger is that the day will come when they will lose their appetite for the U.S. bonds.
Sure. Well, we've managed to export the biggest part of our manufacturing facilities, many of them to China. Excuse me. And I think that we need to make a little change in our laws so that we'll get our industries back and stop moving everything overseas. And that's not difficult to do. Up until 1913, we had no income tax. And the government expenses were paid for totally by import duties on imported goods. And then they removed that duty in 1913 and instituted the income tax as 2% on the very wealthy people. And that has grown to about 60% today on everybody.
And of course, that was the system that the Constitution recommended that it should be adopted from day one.
Right. So if we institute duties on imported goods, that'll level it more as far as wages are concerned, because right now it's cheaper to produce things in other countries because their wages are so much lower. And so, what was it, 42,000 factories last year moved from the United States.
Perhaps there's a deliberate policy decided by somebody to deindustrialize the United States.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be. But we could change that if we ever get the people to start voting for the right people.
So
right now, Congress is not doing us any favors.
There doesn't seem to be any indication that the people in there have the interests of the people foremost in their hearts then.
No, they have the interests of the people that are bribing them the most.
Okay, so we need a fresh house.
All right.
Okay, well, let me just clip this here.
Particularly of interest to the listeners.
Yes.
All this is abstract and not much that they can do about. So all you can do is be frustrated by it. But there are things that we can do. And I look forward to getting the word out. And number one, of course, as I mentioned, is health, which is the most important thing. It's much more important than money.